values that might be good, that you have to sacrifice if you want a whole life that in which dependence doesn't exist. So, for example, dependence. For example, I'm dependent on you for a reason. For example, I need you in my life because you're a good friend. Some would say that this makes our friendship dependent friendship, and I would say I'm using you to get something good by our friendship because I'm dependent on you. But at the same time, if I'm completely independent, I might not have the thing that pushes me to start a friendship with you. So after we become friends, I might be able to have a friendship with you, for example, without needing the security I have for having a friend. You might be unable at a certain point in time to give me security. I'm still having that friendship. But the existence of dependence in a lot of creation sometimes is the first point that makes them form relationships. So basically, if you sacrifice dependence, you might have a world in which there are no relationships, a lot of species with no relationships with one another. And the existence of relationships is not by default a completely good thing, but we think of it at least as a good thing rather than loneliness of species. So the existence of dependence itself might have troublesome, it's not all good.
Well, I can answer this on two levels. When we're talking about human beings in here, psychologists have said time and another that dependency is never a good thing. Me and you can be friends. No. Me and you can be friends, but we should not be dependent on one another. My world shouldn't collapse without you. I need you to add a positive value to my life, but if you're not there, I should not be destroyed. This is the first thing. The second thing, that we already, to some degree, live in a life, where each species is separated from the other, but in a different way. Like if we take, for example, the aquatic species, the species that live in water, they got no communication whatsoever with lions. Okay, but even if we make the assumption that dependence is a good thing, when I'm dependent on a friend, I'm not harming my friend. Okay, so we are both on the same level. I'm not harming him. My dependence on him is not causing any harm. But if I'm dependent on some kind of meat to survive, I'm actually killing the cow to eat. So can't there be a world where, I can be dependent on things in a friendly way, like I buy some pet and we're like friends, me and the pet. Okay, but I shouldn't destroy the pet. I shouldn't destroy the thing to get the benefit from it. This is what I'm saying. Yes. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah,
Okay.
so a lot of people have asked why God couldn't create a world where all animals were herbivores. So why can't animals just eat plants? Why do they have to eat each other?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you take a... Yes, if you believe in if you love plants as much as I do. Yeah, but I think that's one of the things that philosophers have kind of, in antiquity and in religious traditions have kind of thought about is the fact that it seems like God has reasons for creating species on their own terms. In other words, God creates some things just to be. But at the same time, God thinks, well, if I'm going to create this thing, I might as well make it useful to other things. So we have species that fulfill, it seems, a dual role. They're valuable in and of themselves. God just wants them to be part of the creation. But at the same time, right, there is this sense that God, right, it occurs to God that if we make the species in a certain way, if I give this species these powers and this species these powers, they could profit from one another, right?
Pardon me, but nearly all the arguments made here are either a speculation or just sentimental. No offense. This is because they address this subject as a primary subject, which is not. This is a secondary subject.
As a primary or a second? Sorry, you said primary?
Most of the discussions address the subject as a primary subject, which is not. It is dependent on nearly 3 fundamental concepts. Once you have a good view of these 3 fundamental concepts, they will yield a good view of this subject. And these fundamental concepts are: you should have a cosmological point of view, the nature, what are the laws of nature, scientifically, without speculations. Then you need to have axiological point of view, what is good, what is evil, and address it like facts, without God intervening in good or evil, just pure good and evil. And then the third concept is the theological point of view. What is God, what God can do, and what he cannot do, do. And what is his relation to the world. And so cosmological point of view, axiological point of view, theological point of view, which are actually philosophy. This is philosophy, physical, metaphysical, and axiological. Once you have a coherent point of views in these 3, there will be no problem of evil in the first place. They will yield a good understanding of the world, with its good or evil, if there is good or evil or not even there. But most of the people just step and jump to address this problem with just a superficial knowledge about God, superficial knowledge about good and evil, superficial knowledge about the universe.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, when you do philosophy for the public, it has to be superficial, right? Well, I mean, we could have started with a whole worldview that this comes from. Instead, what I decided to give you guys was pieces of a worldview. But, I mean, I would be interested to know what you think is missing. That is, I don't really see how those things are missing. At least the philosophers from whom these ideas are taken would say they're approaching all these questions with the same point of view that you think is important, a global point of view, a theological, an axiological point of view.
Do you say that most of the philosophers who address this subject had point of views about the things I mentioned?
Yeah, they have a whole worldview.
I don't know. Maybe they didn't have the complete point of view. Look, I respect Saint Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, but I don't think they did have the right point of view about the universe. I respect Plato or Socrates, but I don't think he had the full right point of view. And the less coherent point of view you had, you will have a problem.
Because they didn't have a scientific point of view?
Maybe that's one element. Maybe it wasn't rational enough. Like in the case of St. Thomas Aquinas, no offense, I'm not talking. Who am I? But that's
I have
what
friends
I'm
who like
saying.
him all the time.
Yeah,
I won't be offended. But
the more evolved point of view, the more evolved world view about this subject you'll have. This is a general problem. Nearly everyone addresses this does not have a good point of view.
yeah, well, I would ask you what your methodology would be then. So methodologically, how would you approach these questions? Would you start with knowing what God is and then work down?
No, start with the right start. What is the right start is to have a good epistemology. You choose what you think is the right epistemology. Use your epistemology in having a good knowledge of ontology and axiology. And that's what is philosophy. You start epistemology, move ontology with the logic and epistemology you had, move axiology, and then this will self-collect. You will have it just understood or understandable or whatever. But people, no epistemology at all. Those who talk do not have a good epistemology, and of course do not have a good ontology or axiology, and they talk in the subject.
I mean, I would disagree. I would just say that I subtracted the epistemology to make it easier.
Yeah, I'm not
We could get
talking
into
about
this,
specifics.
Yeah, but somebody else? Yeah, okay.
Could we say that in world A there really doesn't exist any goodness, or the goodness that exists there is really passive? Thus world B has more goodness, because in world A, if nothing can't be damaged or destroyed, no one really chooses to be good and there's no free will, so it's just kind of a passive goodness. But in world B, people would have either, you know, both choices, and they would choose to do good, so then that would be more good.
So you could say that world A is not a world that allows for moral goodness.
Yes.
So there would be a certain kind of goodness on world A, but it wouldn't be moral goodness.
Yes.
Right? That you could only have in world B. Yeah. Did you want to talk? I mean, I know I took a risk here by not talking about human beings that much. So if you guys want to go back to talking about human beings, I think you had a, yeah.
You're talking to me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. No. No.
Sorry, I forgot what you were asking.
I was talking about hell. How in world A, if we created, if we say that God created the perfect world, which is perfect goodness, and at the same time there's world B in which there's imperfect goodness, or at least the free will. So in where does hell actually factor into this equation? The world of, let's say, perfect evil. But at the same time, I wanted to ask, why do we take it from the perspective that destruction is evil, or is a particularly bad thing? What do we know about things that do not exist? What do we know about things that die? What do we know about things after they've been destroyed in order to assume that it is a bad thing, just because they are not existing, they're not us anymore? Why does that make it a bad thing?
Mm-hmm.
It just makes it something that we don't understand. It doesn't make it the bad thing necessarily. We could not understand it. That's just I believe that this kind of just changes the way that we look at things.
Mm-hmm. So why is destruction a bad thing? I mean, the first thing a lot of philosophers will say is, of course, it's only a bad thing from the perspective of the thing that's being destroyed. So they will add that qualification. So for the plant, it's bad that it's being destroyed. But for the insect, it's a good thing. So from that point of view, no, destruction isn't, I mean, necessarily always a bad thing, except that there is a very strong feeling that what's bad has to probably be the opposite of what's good, and what's good has to come from God. So what's bad is the opposite of God. We kind of have this feeling. What do we know about God? Well, we think God is a source of life. God is a source of creation. God makes things that are possible actual. He takes things that are just possibilities and he makes them real. So when we think about what's bad, we tend to think of what's bad as the opposite of that, right? Bad would be something that somehow diminishes or detracts from what God is in general doing. What God is in general is doing is bringing life to things, making possibilities actual, right, and creating things. So anything that obstructs, right, or gets in the way of that, or detracts from that, we would say is bad. Right? It's part of God's creation, but it's not that we want to say that God goes out with the explicit intention of creating things. God goes out with the explicit intention of bringing things to life. Of course, God sees that destruction is part of the process, but God's main intention, we think, remains to create things, to give them life. So God has got to be, I mean, most philosophers from this tradition will say, on the side of the good. Right? So, yeah.
Well, I didn't understand half of the concepts he was saying. But I kind of agree with him on something that we talked about, does God exist, right, in this beautiful workshop, and then we jumped to the problem of evil. I think we skipped something very important, which is what is God, and how do we define God? Because
right.
Because most of the theories we're talking about here today do not apply if you believe that God is almighty and God can do anything, because I mean you said that God. Where is it? Yes, hold on. The God cannot show or bring the good in us without making us see the bad. See, that can't does not really go in parallel with my belief that God can do anything. Yeah, exactly. The world A and world B theory is dependent on the fact that the more powerful has to really do something bad to the less powerful. But if God can do anything, he can create species that are self-dependent, and subsequently the whole theory collapses. So I think all these theories, if you believe that God can do anything and God has unlimited power and unlimited abilities, they will fall short to a certain point. So I think we have two options. If you believe that God has unlimited power, I think the only explanation to the evil dilemma is God gave us a test, which is free will, and this is and he left us. He raised his hand while he can intervene, but it's a test, and subsequently you get rewarded or punished for the actions that you do on earth. And one last thing, when it comes to the point that you said that God cannot create someone that is more powerful than he is, so therefore God cannot create anything. I think it was answered in the last lecture, which when he said that God can create anything or do anything that is logical. What you're asking is not logical. So yeah. Thank you.
Okay, basically the whole dilemma we're facing is that we're talking about the Christian God. We're not talking even about the Muslim God. So the Muslim God is not submissive to logic. So the Muslim God created logic. Basically, the Christian God cannot basically be illogical. The Christian God should be logical. So the dilemma is basically that in the Muslim tradition, you sacrifice the idea of believing in some sort of absolutes like logic and mathematics to believing in the God that even created this, so that God could choose to be illogical. In the Christian tradition, if God chooses to be illogical, God is no more God, because God chose something that is bad. So it's a very different understanding. And the problem of evil itself comes from a Christian tradition. So if we take the monotheistic tradition out of the image altogether, the Muslim, the Christian, and the Jew, and then we go to other traditions that basically believe that, for example, ancient Greece. Ancient Greece had gods that we could see as very evil. However, the concepts that are behind them are basically considered what is good within the Greek society. So, for example, a god of war, we think of war as a bad, evil thing, but basically they did not think of it this way. So, if we have different definitions to what is good and what is evil, and what a god is, we're always thinking of the problem of evil from the context of the Christian tradition, or in some few cases in the monotheistic tradition. But it will be all screwed up if we think outside it, because there are some traditions that basically think of a god of evil, that think that evil could be a god somehow, and that it is not considered, they don't have that antagonistic image to evil and God being together.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it's very, I have to say, it's kind of, it's weird having a conversation with a Muslim, because, you know, you often say things like, well, God wouldn't do this, right? And, right, my students will always say, well, God can do anything, right? I wonder how strongly it is believed, though, that God can actually violate the laws of logic and do illogical things. For example, if I asked you, could God make good people without giving them free will? Could he do that? Isn't the concept of goodness incompatible with being a robot? Would God say that a robot could be good? I mean, I think if you accept that, right, from God's point of view, right, there is such a thing as goodness, and that is incompatible with somebody just being a robot. I think you believe that because you believe that angels are not as good as human beings. Why not? Because they're robots. So, goodness entails being free, right? That we think is God's concept of goodness. So if I say to you, well, God can't create somebody who's good without giving them free will, and your reaction to that is, well, God can do anything he wants, then I think you're not really listening to, it feels to me like you're not really listening to what I'm saying. I'm not saying that there's a limitation on God's power. I'm just saying that God's concept of goodness is such that if he wanted to create that goodness, this is what he would have to do. Right? If God believes that this is good, then this is what follows. Right? No? Okay. Angels are still better? Really? Okay. Mm-hmm.
I just have to, yeah. I just have to say that I entirely disagree with what you said about the Christian God being under logic and the Muslim God being a creator of logic. I'm Christian, and I don't know that much about God, but I can tell you that logic is also one of the things that he created.
Well, I don't know when we talk about, logic and stuff like that, I think, Dr. Robert, maybe you could say it, but I would say, there's logic and there's logic. I would say, let's say God has his own definition of certain things, right? And apparently, right, we would have the ability to understand how God defines certain things. And then it wouldn't be consistent for God to define something one way and then believe the opposite. So here God sets his own rules. Right? I don't think you would say he's bound by the laws of logic. What you would say is he creates the rules by which he thinks, right? He thinks this is good, right? And I think many Christian philosophers take that view, if I'm correct. I'm pretty sure that that's right. Right. So many philosophers in the Christian tradition will say God defines what good is, right? And then he sticks to that, right? So God says goodness is life. God says goodness is creation. And then God couldn't create a world where killing babies was the norm, because that would be in contradiction with how he had defined goodness, right? Now if I say that, I'm not saying God is limited by the laws of logic. No, I'm saying God makes the rules that God chooses to abide by. And that's what makes him so great, is that he says, this is what I call good. And now I'm gonna do good things. And then you can say, well, God wouldn't do the opposite of that, because that would be God contradicting himself. I think the only difference between Christianity and Islam, and of course I'm not an expert, is that I think there's more room sometimes in Islam to say God might be able to, I think Christian philosophers, I don't know the Islamic tradition that well. Dr. Bello didn't come, did she? No, okay. Yeah, I told her to come so she could answer this question. But I think that it is more prominent in the Christian tradition to insist that when God makes these rules by which he thinks, right, and by which he does things, he sticks to them, right? Why? Because he commits to them. Yeah. So God's not going to make a world one day in which, right, life and creation and birth are good, and then he's going to start, right, creating a world where babies die in huge numbers the next minute. No, we can't believe that God would do that. Did you want to go back to the topic of hell? I'm sorry, I didn't answer the hell question. The question was, how does hell fit into world A and world B? Here we have to talk about what people think about hell, right? Because actually this is the hardest part of it's hard enough to convince an atheist that evil is compatible with God's goodness and God's existence. But then when you tell an atheist that you believe in hell, it's even harder to convince them that there is a God who would create a hell. That is, how could a God who is good create a hell? By which I mean, right? So the problem there, according to some, is that it seems like hell is a place from which in the Christian tradition, I think I understand that in Islam, you can work your way out of hell. Is that correct?
Not everybody. Some people stay out.
Okay, right.
Most people get out.
Right. So the question then is, right, we have these various religious traditions that say you can do something so bad that you're punished eternally and there's no chance for redemption. No chance. Things can never get better for you. And I think that's something that people have a hard time dealing with. Now, what would hell be? According to some philosophers, hell would be, well, if we continue with this theory, right, where we believe that badness is lacking things or missing things. Hell is what happens to you, according to some people, when you lose all the good personality traits that a human being should have. So a murderer has lost already many good personality traits that a human being should have. It's possible that if you keep losing personality traits that a human being should have, you will continue to lose them. And what will be left of you if you have no personality traits left that a human being should have? You will almost be nothing. You will be nothing. You will be nothing except what's left when a person doesn't have a single good quality. And some people would say, that is hell. That is, right? If I take all the goodness out of you and all the hope and all the good qualities, and then I just leave you to suffer. Of course, a person without any good qualities would just be nothing but just suffering. That's hell. So then the question that philosophers ask, so obviously that seems like it could be part of world B, right? In world B, there would be, so it's possible that God could create a world in which you had different levels of goodness, and you have also a possibility that things could decrease in goodness to the point at which they're nothing but suffering and have no chance for becoming better. And that would be hell. So you could have that, but then you would have to say, well, so, I mean, did you have a more specific question? Like, yeah, then the question would be, okay, well, yeah, maybe God would still want that kind of world because he would want a world in which there was justice, right? So the things that become good and continue to become good, well, things that become good, their reward for becoming good is that they continue to become good. They become more and more powerful, therefore, right? And then they live longer and maybe live forever. And then on the other hand, things or people that become worse, their own punishment is to continue becoming worse. So God's not really doing anything to them that they didn't do to themselves. They let themselves become worse. He lets them become worse until, right, they can't get any better. But you could say, well, God would let that happen, right? What's the point? Yeah.
I think this is an evil God. Okay. So I want to answer him and her. So this is the last thing we have to finish. It's time. The question of test makes God extremely evil in some points of view. So actually I agree with this. This is something I agree with. But that argument is also counter-argued. You can argue back. The idea of test make God like an evil teacher who basically wants you to go through a test to make you choose and then mark you as a good person or a bad person. And based on this test gets you somewhere. We believe that a teacher is good because when a teacher gives you a bad mark, the teacher is basically trying to get you better or to teach you something. But when God just judges you and makes you go through a test to get you somewhere bad and give you a bad mark without any sort of a goal after this, he's just being evil. Imagine a teacher who just wants you to give you bad marks, wants to get you through tests and tests and tests, and you're a bad student, to always give you bad marks without a goal of it.
So, yeah.
He met one person. But this way, God gave us a choice to choose free will. But how could we choose if we don't have free will at the beginning? No. If we got a choice to choose free will, then we had free will at the beginning. If we got a choice to choose free will and to go through the test, then we chose something. And if we chose something, we had free will prior to it. And if we had free will prior to it, then God chose to make us choose between two things and to make us go through free will without asking us. Understand the point. Concerning Nancy's point, concerning hell, Nancy, concerning hell, the whole point in a lot of arguments against the defending God from the problem of evil, a lot of people who really make these arguments are not people who believe really in the image of heaven and hell. So they don't have to go through this challenge of saying what is the point. They would say basically that life is a good thing and that there are good, they would make arguments like that without saying that there is an end of a heaven and hell. So you don't have to go through this question and to make that argument and to go through defending this argument. Others, the very religious and standing with the idea of heaven and hell, will find another explanation, like the idea of the idea that Professor Weiss said about the destruction that you choose, not that God chooses for you. It's self-destruction in which God just stands doing nothing. And this had also problems. So it's not always the case that when you have the problem of evil, the person who's defending God believes in heaven and hell. A lot of philosophers do not really believe in it the way we think of it, at least, especially in the very modern Protestant Christianity, for example. The second thing we have, this is the last lecture for part 1. We have part 2, which is morality. We're starting with a bounding lecture between the two, which is religion related to morality? Last time we're talking about religion. Next time, it's just a little bit about the debate itself, whether religion is related to morality, yes or no. Professor Fincham, who is the chair of the department, is giving the coming lecture. And then we have 3 other lectures in the morality part. The coming lecture, part 2, is morality related to religion, is April the 18th. I think it's the day after Easter. يوم الثلاث اللي بعد شم النسيم. I want you here.
Thanks, everyone.